So now, without further ado, Dr. Matt Yost.
Very good. Thank you very much. My apologies for not being able to be there in person. We have an event up here in Logan, an extension event with the Cache County that I had some prior arrangements for. So, but a great pleasure to speak to you remotely today, and first time doing this. So I hope it goes well. It's kind of hard not to see you and interact with you there in person, but hopefully still find this of use and value. The slide changed okay, correct? Okay, great. Okay, so I hope you appreciated the title of my presentation. And today we're going to talk about what actually the end of an alfalfa stand, the last hurrah of an alfalfa stand. So you're getting ready to terminate it, or you've terminated it. And I think it's very important to realize that alfalfa keeps on giving. It's best thing I could compare it to was the Energizer Bunny. It just keeps going. It adds a value and benefit to other crops in your rotation. And if you can account for that, it will save you a lot of money. And I'm going to show you how to do that today. I would ask for a raise of hands, but I can't see anyone. So I'd ask who's familiar with the nitrogen credit, and hopefully some of you are. Hopefully you've learned about this in school before, or through experience. But the alfalfa nitrogen credit is an incredible thing. Alfalfa is a legume, and as a legume, it fixes nitrogen. And how it does that is it forms a relationship with bacteria in the soil. And I've represented that there on the slide with those little pink dots. So there's these rhizobacteria in the soil, and they have the ability to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, out of the air, and convert it into forms that alfalfa can use. And so that's the reason why we typically don't put nitrogen fertilizer on our alfalfa. It just doesn't eat it. It gets its own. So alfalfa feeds the bacteria, and in return, the bacteria give it nitrogen. And so through that process, there's a lot of nitrogen that becomes available when we kill that alfalfa plant. And so what happens is during the life of the alfalfa, there's some nitrogen that leaks out of the roots. Roots tend to be a little bit leaky. And so you're getting some buildup of nitrogen in the soil as you're getting near the end of an alfalfa stand. And then if you plow up or you return any residue, any biomass of alfalfa into the soil, you're also going to get some nitrogen in that. And then there's a fair amount of nitrogen that's inside the alfalfa roots. And those roots, as many of you probably know, take some time to decompose. I've been in alfalfa fields probably 3 years after they were killed, and you still find roots. It takes some time for those to decompose, but as they're decomposing, they're releasing some additional nitrogen. And so we're getting nitrogen, an excess of nitrogen, when we kill an alfalfa stand. And some of it's coming from the plant, but not all of it. A large part of it is also coming because there's improvements in the soil. There's not very many crops that are as good for soil health as alfalfa. Has deep roots, it's a perennial crop, and it improves the soil over time. It can increase organic matter, it can improve aggregate stability, water holding capacity, and other improvements in the soil that cause mineralization to be enhanced and nitrogen availability to be enhanced. And so we commonly refer to this topic the nitrogen that's left over when you kill alfalfa as a nitrogen credit. And basically what that means is that because we're getting a lot of nitrogen from the soil and from the killed alfalfa, we can reduce or credit the amount of nitrogen that we would typically apply to a corn crop or a small grain crop, for example. And so that difference, that credit, is what we call the nitrogen credit. Now, we have a lot of information on this for corn. I spent 5 years of my life studying the need for nitrogen fertilizer in corn after alfalfa. I did that in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and a few other states. There's also been a lot of work in Utah on that. Earl Creech, Grant Cardin have done numerous trials with corn after alfalfa. And the result of all that work is that corn after alfalfa, at least the first year, rarely needs any nitrogen fertilizer. The second year can also require no nitrogen, but it's more difficult to predict. And there's times when it does need nitrogen. So there's a lot of information for corn, and we know a lot of research across Utah, Midwest, across the country. There's much less research on small grains. And so when I first got to Utah and started talking with people about needs and ideas for research, this was one that surfaced to the top quickly. A lot of people in Utah rotate alfalfa to small grains. A lot do it for forage in the southern part of the state, and a lot do it for grain in the northern part of the state. And so we quickly learned that there was a need to understand how much nitrogen fertilizer should we put on small grains when they're the first crop after alfalfa or the second crop after alfalfa, and how does the type of small grain affect that nitrogen need, whether it's a forage or a grain. So today we're going to talk about both of those aspects. We're going to talk about the nitrogen fertilizer needs of 2 years of small grains harvested for both grain and for forage after alfalfa. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. So I hope you can stick with me here. And first, what we're going to do is we're going to cover all of the grain results. So this is small grains harvested for grain. And then after I go through all these results, we'll then talk about the forage data. So first, we're going to talk about research that we did over the last 2 years. It was on 20 fields in Utah. You'll see that many of them were in the northern part of the state, mainly because we just have a lot more grain production in that part of the state. So all of these trials were on farmers' fields. And what we did was we identified a location in the field, and then we took soil samples before we put on any fertilizer. So after taking the soil samples, we then laid out plots. And I don't know, can you see my mouse?
Yep.
Okay, it might be a little hard to see, and I'll try not to use it much. There it is, sorry. So then what we did is we came in and we put 5 rates of fertilizer. So anywhere from 30, 60, 90, 120, up to 150 pounds of fertilizer in the early spring. And then we replicated that 4 times like we do for research, so that we had a good average, a good estimate of how much fertilizer was needed at each of those fields. And then we came in after the wheat or other small grains were mature, and we took small plot samples for yield out of each of those plot areas. I want to show you here the age of the alfalfa. This will be an important factor that I'll talk more about later. The majority of these alfalfa stands were about 5 to 6 years old when they were terminated. But we had a few that were up to 10 or 11 years old when they were terminated, and we had a few others that were younger than that, 2 to 4 years old. So we had a good wide variety and the age of the alfalfa stand when it was killed. The majority of our small grains were wheat, about 75%. And then we had the rest were, a few fields were barley and a few fields were triticale. We had a variety of irrigation methods, and really in these trials, what we're looking for is a wide variety. That's what we wanted. We didn't want all the same conditions at these farms. We wanted to try to represent lots of different conditions because that's what happens on the ground. So about half of these were will line irrigated. The others were pivot or flood, and we had one that was irrigated with hand lines. Okay, so let's talk about the first year after alfalfa for harvesting that small grain for grain production. Okay, this is really messy, and I apologize, but I want you to focus on the stars. So focus on those yellow stars. What those yellow stars represent are the optimum nitrogen rate for the trials that needed nitrogen. So I'll point out quickly that these black lines indicate that we had five fields where there was no response to fertilizer. We did not need fertilizer to improve yield. At the other 12 fields, we did need fertilizer to improve yield. That's different than what I mentioned earlier we were finding with corn. We saw very little response in corn, but we saw a lot of response in small grains. And so if you look at those stars, you'll see that the optimum nitrogen rate was anywhere from 60 up to about 130 pounds of nitrogen. So we have a pretty wide range. You'll also notice over here the yield. The yield level had no connection to how much nitrogen was needed. So it didn't really matter if we had fields that were yielding 50 bushel. Sometimes they needed no nitrogen, sometimes they needed nitrogen. We had fields that yielded 100 bushels. Sometimes no nitrogen, sometimes they needed nitrogen. So the yield level has no impact on the need for nitrogen. And I think that's important to remember. That sometimes we think if we're producing 125, 150 bushel wheat, that it requires a lot of nitrogen. And in this case, we're just not seeing that trend between yield level and need for nitrogen. Okay, so one might look at this and say, okay, I'm going to put 60 to 120 pounds of nitrogen on my first year grain following alfalfa. What's important, really, really important to remember is that we have to consider the economics. Nitrogen fertilizer costs. It costs money. And so we have to make sure that we put on a rate that's going to return more than what it cost us to put on the fertilizer. Otherwise, it's not worth it. So what we've done here is we've just simply added the economics. We've added the price of the nitrogen, and then the gain that you would get from the additional wheat that you would produce. And when you do that, all that happens is that those stars move to the left because we've now added the cost of the nitrogen. And so now if we look at this, that they're starting to be a little bit more consistent, and we can see that now anywhere from 60 to about 100 pounds of nitrogen is what it will take to economically optimize our grain yield. So in this case, we would say on average, if you put somewhere about 75, 80 pounds of nitrogen on that first year of grain following alfalfa. Okay, a few other questions that we tried to answer was, is split nitrogen worth it? So we get the question a lot about whether I need to put on nitrogen in the fall when I plant, if I'm using a winter wheat or a winter small grain. And so we tested this on not all the farms, but a portion of the farms. And what we did is we came in the fall and we put on 30 pounds of nitrogen near planting. And then in the spring, we put on additional nitrogen. So the blue bars on the figure here are just the regular nitrogen rates that we applied all in the spring. And if you look at the green bars, these are the split applications. So this first green bar here at 60 pounds, it would have had 30 in the fall and 30 in the spring for a split. And so we compared that 60 pounds as a split application to what it would be if you just put 60 pounds on all at once in the spring. And so as you look across there, those different rates, you'll notice that we really saw sometimes we saw a benefit to splitting, but really no consistent and no statistical benefit to splitting an application and putting on nitrogen in the fall. To me, this is good news. It means save some nitrogen, save a trip across the field, and probably just put it on once in the spring and you'll be okay. Plus, if you split your application, it can double your costs for your nitrogen because you have to run across the field twice to apply that, unless you can put it on with the planter. So really saw very little to no benefit of splitting your application and putting some on in the fall. Another question we had is late an application beneficial? If I can watch the crop and look for differences in height or color, and then come later and put on additional nitrogen if it's needed, is there a benefit to doing that? So again, this was not done at all of the farms. Here I'm showing just 4. And at these 4 farms, what we did is we came in at about flag leaf stage and we measured differences in color of the wheat. And then we applied a late application of 60 pounds of nitrogen. And so this comparison here is a late 60-pound application compared to 60 pounds just applied all at once in the spring. And you'll notice here that we saw no benefit to putting on a later application. Again, good news means that put it on in the spring when things aren't, maybe it's not as difficult to put on, or you don't have as much damage to the crop versus trying to wait and do it later. Okay, so that's the first year. Now we're going to move to the second year. So we're in the second year after alfalfa. We're still harvesting this as grain. We have much less sites here. It's more difficult to find these sites. Some producers don't grow 2 years of small grains. A lot of them will go back to alfalfa or to other crops. And so we only had 3 of these locations. At these 3 locations in the second year, we often expect that we're going to see a response. We just don't have as much nitrogen there left over from the alfalfa. We're running out of gas. And so we often expect to see more response. And we saw that. At these 3 fields where we had second year small grains, we saw that all 3 of them needed nitrogen. You'll also notice there the yellow stars that there is quite a variety in the need. So 2 of them needed about 80 to 90 pounds of nitrogen, and 1 needed the full 150-pound rate. So again, when we add the economics, it backs those off just a little bit. On 2 of those fields, on the 3rd field there with the blue line, it stayed the same. It was still that 150-pound rate. So the question that's critical to answer, in my view, is can we predict when there will be a response to nitrogen? I just showed you that most of the time in this scenario, we're finding response to nitrogen fertilizer. But I also showed you that there was 5 fields that needed nothing. And so if we were to tell you, go out and put nitrogen on all your fields, and knowing that sometimes there's not going to be a response, that's going to be a lot of wasted money on fertilizer. And so it's critical that we try to identify when this happens, because if we can, then it means that you can save a lot of money by withholding nitrogen and not have any impact on your yield in some cases. So there's two ways I want to share with you that we've tried to predict this response. So the first is to use soil tests. So in the spring, we went out and we sampled before we fertilized down to a foot, and we measured soil nitrate in these soil samples. This costs about $15 per sample. And so if you were taking a single sample for a field, that might be $15 per field per year. A low cost to find out if you need to apply and spend a significant amount of money on fertilizer for those small grains. So here's what we found. So on the bottom of this figure, you'll see soil nitrate, and you'll see that it increases. So as soil nitrate increases, we would expect to see less response to fertilizer because we have more in the soil, right? If we have low soil nitrate, we would expect to see a high response to fertilizer. And so what we've done here is we've tried to just separate with this dashed line here. We've tried to separate on the left sites that we think should respond to fertilizer, and on the right, those that we don't expect to respond to fertilizer. And so you'll see here that I've circled where we had correct predictions. So on several of these fields right here in this circle, we had a low soil nitrate, meaning that we would expect a response to fertilizer, and we saw it, right? We saw a response to fertilizer. Over here, we had high soil nitrate, and we had no response to fertilizer. So in total, we had this test, this soil nitrate, could separate the fields that needed nitrogen from the ones that didn't about 75% of the time. Now that's actually really, really good. I've done a lot of these kinds of evaluations for corn, and we can't get that high for corn. So this is actually very encouraging and really good news. It means that soil nitrate, in this case, is a good indicator of whether or not we need nitrogen. So we can now say, if you're questioning whether or not you need to put nitrogen on your grain crops following alfalfa, go out and take a soil sample. Look at the nitrate. And if your nitrate's low, put fertilizer on. If it's high, don't, because you'll save a lot of money on fertilizer. So very, very positive and very good results with soil nitrate. We also tried a second way to do this, and this way was using the color of the wheat. We wanted to know if the color could help us separate response or no response. And so there's some tools, there's devices out there that can do this. They're called, some of them are called a SPAD meter. Basically what it's measuring is the greenness of the leaf, chlorophyll content. Now these are kind of expensive. Most of these units that are good quality are a few $1,000s to purchase. But that's a one-time cost, and you can use it time and time again on as many acres as you would want. So basically what we did at flag leaf is we came in and we measured the greenness of the fertilized and the non-fertilized wheat. And we wanted to see the difference. Was there a color difference when we put fertilizer on? And so we measured those, and then we related them to each other. So on the bottom of the figure here, what this means, at 100%, it means that the fertilized and the non-fertilized wheat were the same color, the same greenness. Now, if we come back here to 80%, it means that the non-fertilized wheat was a lot less green than the fertilized wheat. We could see some visual differences. So it's the same concept here, right? When we see a large difference in color, we would expect to see a response to fertilizer. When we don't see a lot of difference in color, we would expect low response to fertilizer. Now this approach did not work very well. You can see that sometimes we could correctly separate responsive and non-responsive, but there was a lot of cases over here where the wheat was approximately the same color as the non-fertilized as the fertilized, but yet there was still a response to fertilizer. So summary here, this was not a good indicator of response to nitrogen. Stick with the soil test, soil nitrate. It was the better indicator of response to nitrogen. So to summarize for grain, in that first year after alfalfa, there's some opportunity to withhold nitrogen. In some cases, I showed you that 5 out of those 17 fields did not need nitrogen, and that would save you a lot of money. Nitrogen, it can be expensive. Now, the key here is that only do that if your soil nitrate is less than 21 parts per million. And if it's, excuse us, sorry. So there's lots of opportunity there to withhold nitrogen if you have a high soil nitrate. If you do need nitrogen, if your nitrate is low, then we would suggest that you put on about 75 pounds of nitrogen for that first crop. For the second crop, our data is limited. I showed you we only had 3 sites. We really can't make a lot of conclusions from those 3 sites, but we know that that second year will usually require some nitrogen. And if you're trying to decide whether or not to put nitrogen on that second year crop, then we would suggest, again, use soil nitrate tests. They should be a good indicator if you need to apply nitrogen. And stay tuned. We've got another 8 or 9 trials in the ground right now. And so by the end of 2020, we'll have more information on the second year crop. Okay, take a deep breath. We're halfway through. Now we want to talk about forage. And the results will look very similar style format for the forage. So we had 14 trials, 14 fields that were forage following alfalfa. These, you'll notice, are more spread out across the state, and we have more of them in the central southern regions. The age of the alfalfa in these trials was very similar. We had a lot that were around that 5 to 6 years old, but we had a couple again that were 10-year-old stands. This trial, we had a lot of diversity. There's several types of small grain forages that are grown in Utah, and we covered a good variety. So we had a lot of the single species, wheat, triticale, barley, oats, and then we have several that were 2-way and 3-way mixes of those species. Okay, here's the result. So we had 14 fields, and of those 14 fields, only 3 of them needed nitrogen, much less than what I showed you earlier for the grain sites. And these 3 sites, we think we know why they responded. I think there's some good reasons why they responded. Again, I just want to point out that the yield level really had no impact. We had some really high yielding forage that needed no nitrogen. We had some medium level yields that didn't need nitrogen and some that did. So yield level really wasn't a factor there. One thing that was important in this trial and these sets of trials was the age of the alfalfa. So that blue line, you'll notice that it had a 10-year-old alfalfa stand. And we think that was a factor in why it responded to nitrogen. As stands get older, the alfalfa plants thin out, we get more grass, we get more weeds that take and use nitrogen and leave less for the following crops. The other first year site that we had that also responded in the northern part of the state, it also had a 10-year-old stand. So 2 of those 3 trials that responded were following really old alfalfa. The third one there, the green line, was a second year after alfalfa trial. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we do expect to see a little bit more response in that second year. So it's not surprising that we were seeing a response in the second year after alfalfa. So, and again, notice here that these were responding to, so this site here in the blue, it did have a linear response to nitrogen. So yield increased as we put on more nitrogen. However, when you add the economics, the nitrogen's not worth it. The yield increase was not high enough to pay for that nitrogen. And so the optimum N rate on that trial in the blue line there actually would have been 0, no fertilizer. So in reality, out of those 14 trials, we had 1 that needed nitrogen the first year after alfalfa, and we had 1 that needed nitrogen the second year after alfalfa. So very, very low occurrence of nitrogen response when we were growing forage. So we tried to answer some of the same questions. Again, this is that split application. Did a split application make a difference for forage? No, it did not. Very similar to our grain example there. We suggest you put on nitrogen in the spring and avoid split applications in these scenarios because they really provide no benefit. Now quality is also really important to look at. If we see enough improvement in quality of the forage, it could pay for additional fertilizer, additional nitrogen. So we looked at 2 quality parameters based on what farmers told us were important to them, what they use. And the first is protein. And you'll notice there that a significant number of those trials had an increase in protein when we applied fertilizer. So it means that nitrogen was getting into the wheat, into the forage. It was getting into the plant and increasing protein. It just wasn't increasing yield. So if there is incentive for you to increase protein, if you get paid more for protein for forage with higher protein, then you might want to think about some nitrogen. Or if you're feeding it on your operation and you've quantified the benefit of higher protein in your mixed ration, then it could warrant some nitrogen. So if protein is important, you may want to put on some nitrogen. How much to put on is a difficult question. You'll notice there that we had anywhere from 40 up to 150 pounds of nitrogen was the rate that optimized your protein. And so that's a wide range, and it's hard to say what the correct rate would be. The best you might be able to do is just take somewhere in the middle and say if protein's important to you, maybe put on 75, 80 pounds of nitrogen and try to hit somewhere in the middle of those responses. The second thing that we looked at was total digestible nutrients. And here it was a different story. Only a few, so only 3 of those 14 fields did we see an increase in total digestible nutrients when we applied fertilizer. So really not a factor that will be that important as you're deciding or determining when to put nitrogen on. So we also tried to predict the response to nitrogen for these forages. So you should recognize this figure, hopefully, from our earlier discussion. And this is the soil nitrate. And you'll notice here that it did not work as well, nearly as well at all compared to how it worked for the grain. So only about 40% of the time could we separate non-responsive to responsive using the soil nitrate for the first year forage. However, we saw the opposite result. So when we looked at the greenness of the forage, it actually worked quite well. When we had forage that was very similar in color to the fertilized forage, we saw no response. When we saw a large difference in color, that's when we saw some response to fertilizer. So this test for forage worked about 86% of the time. And so it was a good indicator of whether or not we needed to apply nitrogen for forage following alfalfa. Okay, so to summarize for forage, so in the first year, we really saw very little response. And so we would say in almost all cases, just withhold nitrogen from first year small grains that are grown for forage. The conditions that I would give, the two conditions that would warrant some nitrogen application would be if you're following really, really crummy stands, really old stands, poor stands that are maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 plus years old, then you might need some nitrogen. The other condition is if there's some compensation or incentive for increased protein, then it could warrant some nitrogen fertilizer. Otherwise, you can withhold it and save quite a bit on your fertilizer bill. If you'd like to predict it, you're worried or concerned that you can't withhold nitrogen, try out a strip where you don't put nitrogen on a few strips in your field, or you put nitrogen on in a few strips and leave it off the rest of the field. And then look at the difference in the color of the forage. And if you need one of these SPAD meters or want to try one out, we have a few and we'd be happy to loan you one or let you try one. But you can use one of those meters to help you know whether or not you need to fertilize that wheat. Now, I will leave with the caution that the color of wheat can be misleading. You can have some color differences in your wheat or other forage and still have no need for nitrogen fertilizer. So you've got to be careful when you're just using visual signs, visual cues of difference in the need for nitrogen. The second year, again, our data is limited here. There was only four trials. But I do want to point out that I showed you that one of those trials needed nitrogen, right? It needed about 60 or 70 pounds of nitrogen, but the other three did not. And I think that's really significant. It indicates that there are some cases where alfalfa can provide all of the nitrogen that two small grain crops would need. And that's huge. That's a lot of savings in nitrogen fertilizer if we can predict it. And the challenge is trying to predict it, and we're trying to work hard to do that. But right now it's hard. We have so few sites that it's really hard to separate those yet. So the best that we can say now is that you might be able to withhold nitrogen in some cases, but in a lot of cases you might need it. Again, if you really want to narrow this down, we could utilize leaf greenness with the SPAD meter to help guide some applications in that second year forage crop. But stay tuned again, we're still working on this and trying to find good ways to separate response from no response. And here is just a summary of everything. I tried to make this simple and use pictures because I know I've covered a lot of ground. So this was the simplest way I could think of to try to summarize. So for grain, if you're growing grain following alfalfa, utilize a soil test. And if that soil test is if nitrate is less than 21 parts per million, then it's a great idea to put on nitrogen. And 75 pounds approximately was the rate that was best in the majority of our trials. If you're growing forage following alfalfa, the need for nitrogen in the first year is going to be a lot less, a lot lower. You shouldn't see a lot of response. And so we would suggest that you just withhold it. Withhold it in that first year, unless, as I mentioned, unless you're following a really old crummy stand of alfalfa, or unless there's some incentive for protein or some compensation or incentive for protein. So with that, I'll say thank you. I do just want to mention a couple brief things here in closing. And one is that we're trying to really expand our reach. And so we've developed social media sites, website, newsletter, other things to try to get information out to you faster and more frequently. And so if you focus your camera on the screen, you can maybe pick up that QR code and get a link to our Facebook. If not, look up USU Crops or Utah Crops and you should find us. We have a Facebook, an Instagram account, and a Twitter account. We also send out this little one-page article once a month through emails. And it's a little email called From the Field. And basically what we do is once a month, we just send out a short one-page article on a variety of topics, things that you heard today, other topics on a variety of things like soils and weeds and pests and economics and irrigation, just a large variety of things that would affect your crop production. So if you're interested, please check out some of those things. And thank you. I'll take some questions now if we have a few minutes.
Okay. Matt, can you see me?
I cannot.
Okay, it's a little dark in here, but you can hear us, right?
I can, yep.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, back in here.
Curious if they ever factored in the organic matter level in the release of nitrogen from organic matter level trials.
Okay, Matt, did you guys factor in organic matter levels in those trials before and after? In soil test OM.
Yes, we did. I didn't show that. I have a figure that shows that. Most of our organic matters on these fields was quite consistent, high 1s, low 2s, and we really see no impact, no relationship of organic matter to need for nitrogen. We know there's some relationship there, but it's just really hard to create a tight relationship. In our work, and I've done lots of work in the Midwest, and it's the same thing. It's hard to relate those things tightly to each other.
Okay, we got another one.
The forage samples where you have triticale and the different freeway grasses and whatnot, the grains. Did you see one of those produce significantly better than the others after eliminating the alfalfa stand?
Okay, Matt, did you get that?
Yeah, I can hear him okay.
Okay.
Good question. We did not test that directly, so the only thing I can do is speculate, which is dangerous to do. You know, we didn't have different forage species side by side testing how their yields compared when following alfalfa. So maybe I won't even speculate because we really, from the data that we have, we really can't say whether one species does better than another after alfalfa. I think they all do well if you have good growing conditions.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Are you better off to go off a soil test or a tissue test give you the same?
Tissue testing versus soil testing. Did you try tissue testing other than the color?
We did not try tissue testing. It would be good to try. We probably should have tried that in our trials. We were trying to look for fast ways to tell in season whether there'd be a need for nitrogen, and that's why we used that Greenness chlorophyll meter. So tissue testing could have been helpful, but we just did not try it in this trial.
In the spring, when you're deciding how much nitrogen to put on, are you better off to stick to the soil sample?
Did you get that, Matt? In the spring, are you in the spring when you're just trying to decide, are you better off with a soil sample?
Yes, if you're growing it for grain. It was a great indicator of nitrogen need for grain. If you're growing a forage, it was not that helpful. And if you're growing it for a forage, I would suggest you just withhold nitrogen, unless it's like I mentioned, unless you have just a crummy, really crummy stand that you're following.